Hi everyone. Today let's talk about Apple earnings, then we'll go over the calendars, then we'll go over Max Payne for the end of the week, then we'll get into the charts, then we'll look at my results for the day and my thoughts going into tomorrow's session. Don't forget to check out the Patreon and the Twitter. If you like trading stocks and options and making money, definitely like and subscribe. I make videos like this every single day that the markets are open as well as Sundays, so make sure you hit the bell so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Welcome to the Portfolio Bulletin. Let's get started. So looking at Apple earnings, they actually beat expectations. They tend to always beat, but I kind of thought the expectation was a little bit high and that they wouldn't beat by enough to maintain their stock price, but that's not how it's working out here. You can see they're up a little bit after hours. And they do mention here that iPhone sales were better than expected, which was one of the concerns. That's more of a consumer discretionary type purchase, and consumer discretionary has definitely been lagging, but that is not the case here for Apple. Looking at earnings per share, they beat by 9 cents. On revenue, they beat by almost $2 billion, and then gross margins here, they beat by 0.2%. So beat across the board. They continue to do exceptionally well. You can see iPhone revenue beat by a couple billion. Mac revenue did miss a little bit. iPad revenue basically on the money. Other product revenue did beat by a little bit. And then service revenue basically in line with expectations. So everything is good here. Keep an eye out for their forward guidance. We'll see how that affects the stock price. But right now, Apple is going up a little bit. Moving over to the economic calendar here, you can see 4-week jobless claims came in higher than expectations, almost 240,000 versus the 217 expected. And that was more than the previous read as well. Non-farm productivity also coming in worse than expectations. And lastly here, you can see the Fed balance sheet coming in here at $8.5 trillion, down about $600 billion from the previous read. So they're definitely offloading their balance sheet, which is good. And you can see their reserves here were actually up a little bit, 3.166 trillion versus 3.12 trillion. Looking at tomorrow's calendar, you can see non-farm payrolls coming in at 8:30, unemployment rate also coming in at 8:30, 3.6% is the forecast. 3.5 was the previous read. Non-farms expecting 180,000. This has had a couple of reads which were pretty far off of the expectations, so maybe this has an impact early in the pre-market, so we'll pay attention to these. I'll definitely put something out on Twitter and the Patreon, so check those out. Moving over to earnings, you can see Apple did very well, and basically everything is green here. We have just a couple of reds, Shell on earnings, Ferrari missed on revenue. Otherwise, pretty much everything else beat expectations here today. Pretty impressive. And then looking at tomorrow here, you can see no major players. Warner Brothers Discovery, fairly interesting. Adidas, interesting. But otherwise, not much. Moving over to Max Payne, you can see Max Payne is at 410. Put call ratio just above 2 here on the SPY. Not a ton of options, 1.4 million. Big call wall here at 415. Put wall here at 400. Decent amount of puts at 405. And then 410 is that Max Payne. Decent amount of puts there as well. If I had to make a prediction, it seems like between 405 and 410 tomorrow makes the most amount of sense. But it wouldn't shock me if we ended up somewhere between 400 and 405. You can see that nice valley here, 402 to 403. There would certainly be some puts that made money at that level, but it's not awful. If it did drift a little bit higher tomorrow, 407, 408 makes sense. So keep these levels in mind as we go into the close tomorrow. Moving over to the charts, starting with the S&P 500 here on the hour and the 12-hour. You can see we ended up closing lower. It was a bearish day. Not as bearish as I thought. We ended up chopping around this 405.29 level. We held above the 144 EMA here on the 12-hour chart. You can see we touched that level and then bounced. We are below my support line. If we hold below this into tomorrow's session, I would expect that this is going to go through. We'll get a second test of the 144 EMA, which coincides with this previous low. And then once that starts to break, then I would expect around another 1%, 1.5% of downside going into the close tomorrow. Remember, we have that big put wall at 400. I wouldn't expect to close below that level. But if we did come into that 402 area like we talked about at the close, that would definitely make sense. Momentum on the 12-hour as well as our SI, both pointing to bearish. But the 1-hour chart is fairly neutral. We're still below all the EMAs and SMAs as well as VWAP, but you can see we actually ended up chopping sideways pretty well after we had that initial drop. Moving over to the NASDAQ here on the 15 and the 12-hour, you can see we dipped below my level, bit of a fake out, and then just a couple of candles later we were back above it. So I did lose a little bit on this dip, but I got right back in once we were above my level, expecting that this was going to hold throughout the session, which it ended up doing here. And you can see we're actually rallying a little bit after hours based on that Apple earnings. 12-hour chart still very bearish. Looking at this support line, we're at trend support as well as horizontal support. If this comes up and bounces to 319.60, that certainly is possible. We are below all the EMAs and SMAs besides the 144 EMA, so short-term bearish, but it does look fairly similar to this move where we came down, retested trend support, and then rallied. And we could certainly get another iteration of that. So we're at a critical point, and we have to watch which way this breaks. And if Apple earnings continues to rally here, you could certainly see this move back up to 319.60 like we talked about. If 316 breaks, I'm then watching down to around that 314 level, about a 1% down move from where we are right now. Moving over to the Russell and the Dow here on the 12-hour chart, you can see it was bearish pretty much all day. We ended up making a lower low on both of these charts. Momentum is bearish, RSI bearish, volume picking up as this continues to go lower. I would expect both of these to go lower again tomorrow. And the Russell's at a very key level here, watching this 170.35 level. We're below it here after hours. We had a couple of wicks to that major trend line just below here. And if those start to break down, we've talked about this multiple times, there's a lot of downside below this 167.47 level. Similarly, on the Dow, you can see we're below that 332.44 level, came down and tested that next level to the penny, 329.40, touched that level, and then bounced right back into the middle of the range. So these are your levels for tomorrow. If we hold above 329.40, might be a little bit of a bullish trade. If we come up and test 332.44 and then we start to move lower, that's going to be a pretty good sell-off in my opinion. Both of these are being pretty heavily impacted by the financial sector right now, and that's why these are both a little bit weaker than the SPY and the NASDAQ. Moving over to Apple and Tesla here, you can see Apple wicking that high again up to 170.90. Just below that trend line. We'll see if this breaks down here again tomorrow. Still in an uptrend, although we are at key resistance. We'll see how this plays out. If the earnings and the guidance are not enough to break this upper resistance, we might start to see a pullback. This has been quite the run from all the way down at 125 up to 170, almost 171 here, with basically no pullbacks. So it does seem like we're due for a little bit of a pullback. Not saying that we're going to come all the way back down and double bottom or anything like that, but it does seem like something to the downside would make sense. Allow buyers to kind of recommit, and then we'll see what happens from there. Tesla, on the other hand, absolutely flat, continues to channel in this zone. We had the dip, recovered that, had a little bit of a rally, couldn't get up to resistance, and then went sideways. We are on top of VWAP, the 9 and 21 EMAs, but we're still below the 55, 144, and 200 SMA. And once these start to drift down, if those EMAs start to pressure the price out of this range and break back down to the downside, otherwise no bias right now on Tesla. Moving over to AMD and Meta, you can see AMD had a huge spike today. There was some news that came out saying that Microsoft is going to collaborate with them for AI in terms of chips. And based on that information, they spiked up hugely here, took out all of the down moves from yesterday just for a moment here, and then we're back in the middle of this range. This certainly looks a little bit better now after coming off of that 200 SMA, coming back up to resistance here. Still definitely a downtrend, at least in the short term. But any news to do with Microsoft and AI is certainly powerful enough to push AMD to the upside. So keep an eye on this one. Definitely interesting. Meta, on the other hand, starting to roll over a little bit, looking at the 144 EMA. Looking at the 55 EMA down here at 225.11 as my next level of support. And then we have the tops from this previous consolidation around 221. So keeping an eye on this. Momentum bearish, RSI definitely bearish here on Meta. Moving over to Snowflake and Etsy. Snowflake had been building in this range for a little bit. You can see here on the daily chart. And then we popped up to the 200 SMA. This has happened a few times here where we came up, chopped, and then came back down. But now we're testing that level again. And if it breaks from here, we might see a push all the way up to 175, these previous highs. That would definitely be interesting here. So Snow going on the watch list does seem to have some bullishness going into tomorrow. Etsy, on the other hand, had a huge red bar here today. Definitely not what you want to see. It looked like we were breaking out of this wedge on earnings. Did not happen. Came down to my next level of support at 90.96. Ended up holding at that level. We'll see what happens here. If that level continues to break, then my thesis here is probably not going to happen. We'll see how it plays out. Still watching this level. But overall, my thoughts here on Etsy are not as bullish as they were while we were holding above my 150-cent level. Moving over to Staples and Discretionary, pretty much the same as yesterday. They're both selling off, but Staples is still holding up much better. Discretionary looks very weak. We're below all the EMAs and SMAs, looking at that 143 level to the downside. If that breaks, then 141 is my next level. Moving over to energy and oil and gas, you can see they have sold off dramatically. We've hit the next level here, 78.47. We're below that level, so the next one is 75.78 here on energy. This is starting to look a little cheap. We're oversold pretty strongly here on the 12-hour. Big volume over the last couple of candles, indicating that this sell might be concluding here soon. Getting into this previous range, definitely interesting. I would still be patient. This is still going lower. But if we start looking at 75.78 here, that's going to be pretty bullish in my opinion. And zooming out here, you can see that's pretty much the same region that we've been in for quite a few months. Certainly have some levels all the way down here at around $69.50 or $70. But it's still a much better entry point than when we were up at around $87. So keep an eye on this one. Oil and gas, on the other hand, definitely looking super bearish. We're below this next level of support. We're also very close to getting below this midpoint based on this high, lower high setup. If this breaks down here, in my opinion, there's a lot of downside. Down to around 110 would be the next level at this previous dip, and the highs going back to November of 21. And then below that, there's a little bit of support in this zone, but really I would be watching down around $93. So this is starting to roll over pretty aggressively here on oil and gas. Moving over to transports, we talked about this one being kind of weird yesterday with the huge aftermarket push, and that ended up gapping down and moving lower. So that makes sense. We ended up testing that resistance line, going lower, but we're back in the mid-range, and then we'll see what happens from here. If the Dow continues to go lower, I would expect transports to continue to go lower, but seeing those moving back in the same direction does make sense. Moving over to semiconductors just for a moment, you can see we had that rally back up to that trend line that we were watching, and now we're breaking down off of that level. We're still above this 242.49 level. We're down a little bit after hours, pretty much right at that. If this breaks down and takes out this previous low, then you're going down to around 229 in my opinion, and then we have the 144 and 200 SMAs here on the daily chart. Overall, semiconductors looking quite weak in my opinion. Moving over to stocks above their 50 and 200-day averages here, you can see the 50-day average is moving lower. We got another bearish candle, tested the 55 EMA, which ended up holding. We didn't get to that 40 level yet. If we break down below this area, I would expect lower lows. Momentum still bearish. RSI still looking bearish. 200-day, you can see we hit that 200 SMA just for a moment, and then ended up basically unchanged on the day. Still bearish, and I do expect this to go lower tomorrow, but it does seem like we're getting a little bit of an initial bounce off of this zone. And overall, if this completes this head and shoulders, breaks this neckline, then this is going to be a very substantial drop in my opinion. Moving over to the dollar here, this has been pretty interesting. So we talked about that big down move yesterday, which did continue into the late evening. And then as soon as morning started, we ended up rallying up to the 55 EMA. We're back above the 102.25 level. And now looking on the daily chart, we're basically going sideways. So we're consolidating now, definitely neutral in my opinion. Like I said, we're back above support. We're not above any of the EMAs or SMAs, and now we just have to wait and see what happens. If we start to develop an uptrend, that would be interesting, but overall neutral on the dollar. Moving over to JNK and TLT, JNK gapped down, tested that next level, just like I thought it was going to, hit that $91, ended up bouncing a little bit from that level. Probably going to be an initial test, and I would expect that to follow through over the next day or next week. We'll see how that plays out. Momentum, definitely bearish. RSI, definitely bearish. And this makes sense. Stocks and JNK going lower together. TLT, on the other hand, gapped down, threw a big wick to fill the gap, and then ended up neutral, still consolidating in this zone. At this point, it looks like somebody is either buying or selling a big position. I would guess that they're buying because of how low TLT is, but at this point, who knows? Certainly could go either way. Moving over to the VIX, we've been absolutely right here. So the VIX started to bottom, saw that divergence down here, started to rally. We're now making higher highs, got above that 20 level, and it looks like we're going to close there. We're at 20.08. If we close above that 20 level, I would expect 22.50. If we don't close above it and we start to pull back, maybe we retest that 18.50 level, and then we start to break higher up to 22.50 and the 200 SMA sitting at 22.72. Overall, very bullish here. Momentum on the daily as well as RSI both look super bullish going into tomorrow's session. Moving over to my accounts here, you can see I made a couple of bucks, about $280. Definitely good to see. I ended up rolling that position for my IRA. I had a 312 put going into the day, and I rolled that out to a 311 tomorrow for a credit, 54 cents on that, and I'm already at a profit of $14 here. Looking at my individual account, I put on a couple of calls and puts throughout the day, all of which would have ended up out of the money, but overall worked out well. I took them off at the end just in case Apple went a little bit wild, but I still have 4 puts and 4 calls here, 310 puts, 311 puts, and then 320 and 322 calls. Most of those are in a decent profit already, but we'll see how this plays out tomorrow. Pretty much unchanged after hours, a little bit up, 316.87, so about 70 cents higher. But of course, the price action tomorrow is going to be very heavily dependent on the non-farm payrolls, as well as the unemployment rate. In terms of the NASDAQ, I'm still neutral. Technology is holding up quite well despite the banking issues. And everything exposed to banking, primarily the IWM and the Dow, are likely to go lower in my opinion. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought of Apple earnings. Did it play out like you thought it would? Also, do you think that the Microsoft AMD deal is going to allow AMD to break out of that short-term downtrend that we're in? Or is it just a short-term pop and we'll start to see that move back down tomorrow or Monday? Definitely like and subscribe if you got any value out of the video. Definitely check out the Patreon and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any future episodes or posts. Of course, none of this is financial advice. This is all for entertainment purposes. Good luck in your trading and have a great day.